Coming up next on Cartoon Network, it's time for some hero action in 1 hour of Ben 10. And coming up over on Cartoon Network 2, it's Pikachu and pals in Pokemon Advanced Battle. Coming up next on Cartoon Network, it's time for Gwen, Grandpa, and our part alien pal, Ben 10. And over on Cartoon Network 2, after the break, it's time for Pokemon Battle Frontier. Stick around, because after the break here on Cartoon Network, we've got the part alien, Ben 10. And over on Cartoon Network 2, after the break, it's Scooby and the gang in Laugh Olympics. Up next on Cartoon Network 2, it's more from that lovable Best Ed. Or push the red button to play with Foster and all of his imaginary friends. Stay tuned for the Scooby Gang next on Cartoon Network 2 in What's New, Scooby-Doo. Or push the red button to play with Foster and all of his imaginary friends. It's some hero action next up on Cartoon Network 2 with the part alien hero, Ben 10. And over on Cartoon Network after the break, it's the grim adventures of Billy and Mandy.
Next up on Cartoon Network, it's time for new Chop Sucky Chooks.
It's time for those Kung Fu kicking chickens. Next up here on Cartoon Network, the Chop Sucky Chooks. Next up on Cartoon Network, we've got the grim adventures of Billy and Mandy. And over on Cartoon Network 2, after the break, it's time for those Sky Knights in Stormhawks. Coming up next on Cartoon Network, it's 1 hour of the grim adventures of Billy and Mandy. And over on Cartoon Network 2, we've got some shape-shifting mayhem with Johnny Test. Coming up next here on Cartoon Network, it's time for the part alien, Ben 10. And over on Cartoon Network 2, after the break, it's Tom and Jerry Tales. Next up here on Cartoon Network, we've got a new episode of the Stormhawks. And over on Cartoon Network 2, after the break, it's a new episode of Pokemon Master Quest. Coming up next on Cartoon Network, it's time for some alien action with Ben 10. And over on Cartoon Network 2, after the break, it's Pikachu and pals in Pokemon Master Quest. Next up on Cartoon Network, we've got the shape-shifting Ben 10. And over on Cartoon Network 2, after the break, it's time for a trip to Gotham with the Batman. Coming up next on Cartoon Network, it's Gwen, Grandpa, and our alien hero, Ben 10. And over on Cartoon Network 2, after the break, we've got a new episode of Pokemon Master Quest. Stick around on Cartoon Network 2, because it's clobbering time next up with the Fantastic Four. Or flip over to Cartoon Network for some stupidity in Ennsville in the grim adventures of Billy and Mandy. Coming up next on Cartoon Network 2, we've got another episode of the Fantastic Four. Or flip over to Cartoon Network, because coming up, it's the grim adventures of Billy and Mandy. Stick with Cartoon Network 2, because next up we check in with the three troublemakers in more Ed, Edd and Eddy. And over on Cartoon Network, it's another road trip in the camper van in Ben 10. Next up on Cartoon Network, it's time for more shape-shifting mayhem with Johnny Test. And over on Cartoon Network 2, after the break, it's time for those high flyers, the Stormhawks. Coming up next on Cartoon Network 2, we've got 1 hour of hero action with Ben 10. And coming up after the break over on Cartoon Network, it's 1 hour of Ed, Edd and Eddy. Stay tuned, because next up here on Cartoon Network, we've got more of our brand new show, Fantastic Four. And over on Cartoon Network 2, it's more weird adventures in the grim adventures of Billy and Mandy. Coming up next, another fighting frenzy with Ash and his pals in Pokemon Battle Frontier. And over on Cartoon Network 2, it's those adult-bashing kids in Codename Kids Next Door. Coming up next on Cartoon Network, we've got 1 hour of alien action in Ben 10. And over on Cartoon Network 2 next, it's our Pokemon movie, Lucario and the Mystery of Mew. Coming up next on Cartoon Network, it's our movie, Billy and Mandy's Big Boogie Adventure. And over on Cartoon Network 2, it's another movie, but this time it's Pokemon Ranger and the Temple of the Sea. Coming up next here on Cartoon Network, it's 1 hour of alien hero action in Ben 10. And after the break over on Cartoon Network 2 next, it's Pokemon Johto League Champions.
Next up on Cartoon Network, we've got new Chop Sucky Chucks. Next up, it's time for some Kung Fu Capers in new Chop Socky Chucks.